Hello and welcome back to our channel. In our last episode, we were thrust into the heart of a waking nightmare. We stood as silent witnesses in Trauma Room 1 of Riverside General Hospital on the chaotic evening of February 19, 1994. We watched as a team of dedicated medical professionals, fighting with every tool of modern science to save the life of a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez, were themselves struck down by an invisible, noxious, and utterly inexplicable force that seemed to emanate from their patient's own body. We chronicled the cascade of terror, the strange, impossible crystals materializing in a vial of blood, the acrid chemical fumes, the fainting spells, the seizures, the evacuation of an entire emergency department into a cold parking lot. The night ended not with answers, but with a profound and terrifying silence. And with the body of Gloria Ramirez, the woman the world's media had already branded with the chilling moniker the Toxic Lady, sealed away like a biological weapon in a specialized aluminum casket. Tonight, in part 2 of our exhaustive investigation, we move from the heat and chaos of the incident itself into the cold, quiet, and deeply frustrating world of the aftermath. This is the story of the investigation. We will follow the coroners, the forensic scientists, the public health officials, and the investigative journalists as they dare to unseal that casket and confront the unknown. Our journey will take us deep into the complex and often contentious world of forensic toxicology. We will meticulously dissect a host of competing theories, each one a desperate attempt to impose logic and reason onto an event that seemed to fundamentally defy both. Was this a tragic but explainable case of exposure to a secret chemical weapon? A scenario straight out of a Cold War thriller? Was it a bizarre industrial accident? A tragic intersection of a sick woman and a hidden environmental toxin? Was it, as some health officials and hospital administrators desperately wanted to believe, a case of mass hysteria? A psychological contagion that swept like a phantom plague through a stressed-out staff? Or was the truth something far stranger, something almost alchemical in its impossibility? A freak 1 in a billion chemical reaction that occurred within the unique, dying crucible of Gloria Ramirez's own body, transforming her, for a few terrifying minutes, into an unintentional human chemical bomb. The search for answers would become a frustrating, labyrinthine, and ultimately fascinating journey. It would pit cutting-edge science against a phenomenon that seemed to break all the established rules of chemistry and biology. It would pit grieving family members against a defensive and tight-lipped medical bureaucracy. It would expose the limitations of our scientific knowledge and leave us, even today, grappling with one of the most profound and persistent medical mysteries of our time. So settle in as we unseal the evidence, weigh the theories, and attempt to solve the seemingly unsolvable puzzle of the unexplained illness and tragic death of Gloria Ramirez. The morning after the incident, a heavy, unnatural silence hung over the evacuated emergency department of Riverside General Hospital. The physical chaos of the previous night had been cleared away, but a palpable sense of fear and confusion remained, clinging to the air like the ghost of the mysterious fume. The ER had been swept by hazmat teams, declared safe and reluctantly reopened, but it was not the same. The psychological trauma was immense. The staff who had fallen ill were either in hospital beds themselves or recovering at home, their bodies and minds reeling from the bizarre and terrifying assault. And in the county morgue, a few miles away, the sealed industrial-grade aluminum casket containing the body of Gloria Ramirez sat in an isolated, refrigerated chamber, a silent metallic question mark at the center of a swirling storm of fear and speculation. The immense and unenviable responsibility for solving this mystery now fell squarely upon the shoulders of the Riverside County Coroner's Office. This was a case unlike any they, or indeed any coroner's office in the country, had ever encountered. They were faced with a profound and genuinely dangerous dilemma. An autopsy was not just an option. It was a legal requirement and a scientific necessity. It was the only way to officially determine Gloria's cause of death, and more critically, It was the only hope of identifying the toxic agent that had sickened 23 people and hospitalized 5. But how do you perform an autopsy on a body that is itself considered a potential biohazard? The very act of making an incision, of opening the body cavity, could potentially release the mysterious fumes again, endangering the coroner and their entire team in an enclosed space. This was not a standard procedure. This was a hazardous materials operation. An extraordinary and unprecedented protocol was devised, one that sounded more like the preparation for handling a leaking drum of nerve gas than a standard post-mortem examination. The autopsy was scheduled for Friday, February 25, 1994, 6 full days after her death. This delay served 2 purposes. It allowed time for the necessary preparations and consultations, and it was hoped that any highly volatile chemicals present in the body might have time to break down or dissipate, reducing the risk. The team that would perform the autopsy would be a small, hand-picked group of volunteers, all acutely aware of the potential danger. They would not be wearing standard surgical scrubs. They would be dressed in fully encapsulated, airtight hazardous materials suits, the same kind the fire department's hazmat team had worn, complete with their own supplied air tanks on their backs. They would be sealed off from the room's environment. The autopsy itself would be conducted in a specially designated and sealed room, equipped with the dedicated, high-flow ventilation system designed to immediately suck any fumes that might be released out of the building and away from the personnel. On the morning of February 25th, under these extreme precautions, the moment of truth arrived. The team, led by Deputy Coroner Dan Cupido, gathered around the sealed aluminum casket. The air in the room was thick with tension. With a deep breath, Cupido and his assistant turned the heavy latches and broke the hermetic seal. As they slowly lifted the lid, a collective breath was held. But there was no sudden rush of noxious gas, no repeat of the ER incident. The air in the room, at least according to the sensitive chemical sensors they had deployed, remained clean. Cautiously, with the deliberate, careful movements of people working with an unexploded bomb, the team began their work. The initial findings of the autopsy were, in one sense, tragically straightforward and unsurprising. Gloria Ramirez's body was riddled with cancer. The pathologist found a large, necrotic tumor on her cervix, and the cancer had metastasized with devastating efficiency. It had spread to her lymph nodes, her lungs, and other vital organs. Her heart was enlarged, a condition known as cardiomegaly, a common finding in patients with the chronic high blood pressure associated with kidney disease. Her kidneys themselves showed clear signs of end-stage failure, a condition known as uremia. From a purely pathological standpoint, her death was not a mystery. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac dysrhythmia, fatal irregular heartbeat due to uremic poisoning from end-stage renal failure, a direct consequence of her metastatic cervical cancer. She had, quite simply and quite tragically, died of her disease. But this solved only one small part of the puzzle. It explained why Gloria Ramirez had died, a question for which there was already a sad and obvious answer. It did absolutely nothing to explain the bizarre, and seemingly impossible, phenomena that had accompanied her death. The oily sheen on her skin, the strange fruity garlicky smell from her mouth, the powerful ammonia-like fumes that erupted from her blood, the impossible manila-colored crystals that materialized in the syringe, and most importantly, the wave of debilitating sickness that had swept through the ER staff. The autopsy had provided a cause of death, but the central mystery remained untouched. The search for the toxic agent, the invisible killer, now began in earnest. This was the task of the toxicologists. Dozens of tissue and fluid samples were meticulously taken from every part of Gloria's body: blood, bile, urine, stomach contents, liver, heart, lung, brain, body fat. These samples were carefully packaged in sealed containers and sent to multiple forensic laboratories across California and the United States. This was a full-court press. They were sent to the county's own labs, to university labs, and even to the ultra-high-tech, federally funded Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, a facility more accustomed to dealing with the chemistry of nuclear weapons than with coroner's cases. The mission given to these scientists was clear and urgent. Perform the most comprehensive toxicological screen possible. Look for any known poison, any illicit drug, any industrial chemical, any pesticide, any substance at all that could explain the events of February 19th. And this is where the investigation, which had started with such high-tech promise, hit its first major confounding roadblock. The toxicology reports began to trickle back in, and they were profoundly, maddeningly normal. They found therapeutic levels of the drugs that had been administered to her in the ER: lidocaine, atropine, and the benzodiazepines. They found acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, codeine, and an anti-nausea medication, all consistent with the palliative care she would have been receiving for her cancer pain. But they found no illegal drugs, no methamphetamine, no cocaine. They found no industrial poisons like cyanide or strychnine, no pesticides, no traces of any known volatile chemical agent that could account for the mass poisoning event. The most comprehensive and expensive toxicological analysis in the county's history had come up completely empty. The invisible killer, it seemed, had left no fingerprints. With the hard evidence of forensic toxicology providing no answers, the investigators were left adrift in a sea of speculation. They were forced to explore a wide range of theories, from the mundane and psychological to the esoteric and highly speculative. To truly understand the Gloria Ramirez case, we must now act as forensic detectives ourselves. We must examine each of these theories one by one, weighing their strengths and weaknesses, and see how they stack up against the strange and specific facts of the case. The very first theory to be floated, and the one that was initially favored by many public health officials and not surprisingly by the hospital administration, was perhaps the most controversial and, to the affected staff, the most deeply insulting. This was the theory of mass hysteria. The concept of mass hysteria, or as it is more accurately known in modern medical literature, mass psychogenic illness (MPI), is a recognized, albeit rare and poorly understood, psychological phenomenon. It describes a situation where a group of people, nearly always under conditions of extreme stress or anxiety, begin to experience real physical symptoms of illness in the absence of any identifiable physical or chemical cause. The theory suggests that one person, perhaps the trigger, experiences a genuine and visible symptom, say, fainting from stress or hyperventilation. Others in the group, witnessing this in a high-anxiety environment and perhaps already primed by a shared fear or a strange stimulus like an odd smell, begin to subconsciously mimic those symptoms. Their powerful belief that they have been exposed to something harmful can trigger very real physical reactions through the complex interplay of the mind and body. Nausea, dizziness, headaches, shortness of breath, tingling sensations, and even fainting. From the perspective of a hospital administrator facing a potential public relations nightmare, or a health department official trying to prevent public panic, this theory was incredibly attractive. It was a neat and tidy explanation. It explained the utter lack of physical evidence found in the ER and in the toxicology reports. There was no toxin to be found because there was no toxin. It also conveniently shifted the focus away from any potential environmental problem within the hospital itself, like a chemical spill, a contaminated ventilation system, or some other form of institutional liability. It essentially framed the event not as a toxic exposure, but as a psychological aberration among the staff. The proponents of the mass hysteria theory, including the head of the California Department of Health and Human Services at the time, pointed to several factors that seemed to support their conclusion. The ER was an undeniably high-stress environment. The staff were dealing with a code blue, one of the most stressful and emotionally charged events in medicine. A strange, foul odor was detected, an odor which, they argued, could have acted as the powerful sensory trigger for the event. Once the first nurse, Susan Kane, fainted, the power of suggestion could have taken over, causing a chain reaction of panic and psychosomatic symptoms among her colleagues. They also pointed out that the most common symptoms reported by many of the 23 affected staff members: nausea, headache, dizziness, a sensation of shortness of breath are classic, textbook symptoms of anxiety and panic attacks. The theory suggested that the staff, caught in a high-pressure situation and primed by a strange smell, essentially panicked themselves into sickness. However, the victims of the incident and a great number of independent investigators rejected this theory forcefully, passionately, and for a series of very good reasons. It simply did not fit all the established facts of the case. First, and most critically, the symptoms experienced by the most severely affected victims were not just vague feelings of unwellness. They were severe, objective, and clinically verifiable medical conditions. Dr. Julie Gurczynski didn't just feel faint. She was hospitalized in the intensive care unit for weeks. She developed clinically diagnosed pancreatitis and hepatitis, serious inflammatory conditions confirmed by blood tests. Most devastatingly, she developed avascular necrosis, a condition that involves the literal death of bone tissue due to a lack of blood supply, a diagnosis confirmed by MRI scans. These are not conditions that can be induced by psychological suggestion. You cannot think your way into having your bones die. Susan Kane, the nurse who drew the blood, also developed verifiable pancreatitis and hepatitis. These are hard, objective medical facts that the mass hysteria theory cannot adequately explain. Second, the pattern of the illness was not random, as one might expect in a case of spreading, unstructured panic. The sickness was directly and clearly correlated with the level of exposure to Gloria Ramirez and specifically to her blood. The staff who were closest to her body, the ones who handled the syringe like Dr. Gurczynski and Susan Kane, got the sickest. Those who were slightly further away, like Maureen Welch, also fell ill. Those who were across the room or who came into the room later experienced milder symptoms or none at all. This suggests a classic dose-response relationship, a fundamental principle of toxicology, which states that the severity of a poison's effect is related to the amount of exposure. This is a hallmark of a genuine toxic exposure, not a psychological phenomenon. Third, the victims were not a random group of suggestible people. They were, for the most part, seasoned ER professionals. These were people who had chosen a career that required them to remain calm, logical, and effective in the most stressful situations imaginable. The idea that this entire team of hardened veterans, people who dealt with trauma and death on a daily basis, would suddenly and collectively succumb to a wave of contagious hysteria struck many as deeply implausible and profoundly disrespectful to their training and professionalism. For the victims themselves, the theory of mass hysteria was more than just a scientific disagreement. It was a deep and personal insult. It was an attempt by the bureaucracy to deny the reality of their physical suffering, to invalidate their experience, and perhaps to absolve the hospital of any responsibility. It felt like they were being blamed for their own poisoning. Due to these strong objections and the powerful, contradictory medical evidence, the theory of mass hysteria was eventually, though grudgingly, discarded by most serious investigators. It was, for all intents and purposes, a dead end. With mass hysteria ruled out, investigators had to turn back to the more plausible, if more frightening idea of a genuine toxic exposure. But if it was a real toxin, where did it come from? This led to the second major theory to be investigated, that Gloria Ramirez had been exposed to some kind of chemical agent before arriving at the hospital, and had effectively and unknowingly carried it into the ER with her, like a tragic typhoid Mary of toxicology. This theory opened up a host of dark and disturbing possibilities. The most sinister of these was the idea of foul play. Could she have been the victim of a deliberate poisoning? The Riverside Police Department was brought in to investigate this angle. They conducted a thorough inquiry, interviewing her husband, her family, her friends. They found a family deep in grief, but no indication of internal strife. no motive for murder. There was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Gloria had been intentionally harmed by anyone. Could she have been accidentally exposed to something at home? This was a more plausible line of inquiry. Investigators in protective gear conducted a detailed search of her Riverside house, looking for any unusual chemicals, powerful pesticides, or industrial solvents. They found the typical array of household cleaning products, but nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could explain the bizarre and potent effects seen in the ER. A more lurid version of this theory emerged in the media and among some investigators. What if Gloria or a family member had been involved in the illicit manufacture of drugs? The production of methamphetamine, for example, is a notoriously dangerous process that involves a cocktail of volatile and highly toxic chemicals. Could the ER incident have been the result of an accidental exposure related to a clandestine drug lab? Again, a thorough investigation by the police into her background, her finances, and her family's activities revealed absolutely no connections to any such criminal enterprises. Gloria Ramirez was a housewife and a mother battling a terminal illness, not a character from Breaking Bad. This theory too led nowhere. This forced the investigation into a third, even more complex and intellectually challenging territory. If the poison wasn't an external contaminant that she had brought in with her, then the only other possibility was that it had been generated internally. This was the most radical and startling idea of all. That a unique, unprecedented, and nightmarish series of chemical reactions had taken place inside Gloria Ramirez's own body, turning her, for a brief and fatal period, into a source of toxic fumes. This theory shifted the focus away from external factors and zoomed in on Gloria's own unique biochemistry, the specific nature of her advanced disease, and the substances, both medical and alternative, that she may have been taking. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn into the world of speculative forensic chemistry, and where we encounter the most elegant, the most compelling, and the most enduringly controversial explanation for the toxic lady mystery. This theory was not developed by the overworked and under-resourced Riverside County Coroner's Office. It was born in the sophisticated high-security laboratories of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. The Livermore Lab, a premier U.S. Department of Energy research facility, was brought into the case by the coroner's office in a bid to bring a higher level of scientific firepower to bear on the puzzle. They were given the full set of autopsy data, the toxicology reports, and the detailed witness statements from the ER staff. Their task was simple to state but incredibly difficult to achieve: solve the puzzle. The team at Livermore, led by forensic chemists, began by doing what good detectives do. They started with the effects and worked backwards to find the cause. What single chemical, or more likely, what chain of chemical reactions, could explain all the bizarre and specific data points from that night? The oily sheen, the garlicky smell, the ammonia fume, the crystals in the blood, and the specific set of symptoms experienced by the ER staff. Their painstaking investigation led them to focus with intense scrutiny on one particular substance that had been mentioned by Gloria's family, but hadn't shown up in standard toxicology tests because no one was specifically looking for it: dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO. As we discussed in Part 1, DMSO is a powerful industrial solvent and chemical precursor that had gained a cult following as a popular, though unproven, alternative pain remedy. It has a remarkable ability to penetrate the skin and be absorbed directly into the bloodstream. The Livermore team hypothesized that Gloria, in immense and constant pain from her cancer, had been applying large amounts of DMSO to her skin in the form of a topical gel, a common method of use. This, they proposed, could explain the oily sheen on her skin that the nurses had noted. It wasn't sweat. It was the solvent base of the DMSO gel. More importantly, the Livermore scientists knew that when DMSO is absorbed into the body, it is metabolized by the body's natural chemistry. It is broken down into other compounds. One of the primary metabolites of DMSO is a substance called dimethyl sulfide, DMS. Dimethyl sulfide is a volatile compound that is known to be excreted through the breath and skin, and it produces a powerful and highly distinctive garlicky or oyster-like odor. This perfectly matched one of the first strange sensory clues reported by the ER staff. Another key metabolite of DMSO is dimethyl sulfone, also known as MSM. Dimethyl sulfone, unlike its precursors, is a stable odorless white crystalline solid at room temperature. The Livermore team hypothesized that due to her severe kidney failure, Gloria's body was unable to filter and excrete these metabolites through her urine as a healthy person would. This would lead to a massive toxic buildup of these compounds, particularly dimethyl sulfone, in her bloodstream, reaching concentrations far beyond anything that would be seen in a normal user. This, they proposed, could be the explanation for the mysterious manila-colored particles seen in her blood. They theorized that when her blood was drawn into the vacutainer syringe, the significant drop in temperature from her body's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit to the ambient room temperature caused the highly concentrated, supersaturated dimethyl sulfone to crash out of solution and spontaneously crystallize. This was a plausible, if unproven, chemical explanation for one of the most baffling and seemingly impossible parts of the mystery. So far, the theory was compelling. It explained the sheen, the smell, and the crystals. But it didn't explain the most critical piece of the puzzle: the powerful toxic fume that had actually incapacitated the ER staff. The smell had been identified by multiple witnesses as ammonia, but the severe symptoms experienced by Dr. Gurchinsky and others were not consistent with simple ammonia exposure. The Livermore team needed a killer chemical, the final toxic product of the reaction, and they believed they found a candidate in a speculative chain reaction, a perfect storm of chemical events that was triggered by the life-saving actions of the ER staff themselves. Their proposed chemical pathway is complex, but it's a truly fascinating piece of forensic and chemical detective work. It deserves to be laid out step by step. Step 1. Gloria Ramirez, suffering from the extreme pain of her advanced cancer, uses large amounts of topical DMSO gel as a home remedy. Her failing kidneys prevent her from excreting the drug's metabolites, leading to a massive unprecedented buildup of dimethyl sulfone, DMSO2, in her bloodstream. Her blood is now a supersaturated solution of this chemical. Step 2. The paramedics and then the ER staff, following standard procedure for a patient in severe respiratory distress, administer 100% oxygen to Gloria through a non-rebreather face mask. Her blood becomes highly oxygenated. Step 3. This is the crucial, speculative, and most controversial leap in the theory. The Livermore scientists theorized that the combination of these two factors, the extremely high concentration of dimethyl sulfone in her blood, and the flood of pure oxygen being forced into her system, triggered a chemical reaction that has no known precedent in human biology. They proposed that the oxygen molecules directly bonded with the dimethyl sulfone molecules, which have the chemical formula Th3-2-SO2, converting them into an entirely new, highly unstable, and far more dangerous compound, dimethyl sulfate, which has the chemical formula Th3-2-SO4. Step 4. This theoretical creation, dimethyl sulfate, is a truly nasty and fearsome chemical. It is not some mild irritant. It is a powerful, volatile, and highly toxic poison used in industrial chemical synthesis. The CDC classifies it as extremely hazardous. It is a potent alkylating agent, meaning it can damage DNA, and it is a known carcinogen. When inhaled or absorbed through the skin, its vapor can be lethal. It is known to cause convulsions, delirium, paralysis, and severe, often delayed, damage to the heart, liver, kidneys, and central nervous system. If this chemical was indeed present in Gloria Ramirez's blood, even for a short time, it would certainly be a plausible candidate to explain the severe and multisystemic reactions of the ER staff. Step 5. This is the final step in the proposed chain reaction, the trigger for the release. The Livermore team proposed that when Susan Kane drew Gloria's blood into the vacutainer syringe, the sudden drop in pressure inside the vacuum tube caused the highly volatile dimethyl sulfate to instantly flash vaporize, turning from a liquid dissolved in the blood into a concentrated cloud of toxic gas. This gas would have erupted from the syringe, directly into the breathing space of the staff members crowded around the gurney. This vapor would be the invisible killer, inhaled and absorbed through the skin and eyes, causing the rapid and devastating symptoms. This comprehensive theory, which came to be known as the DMSO hypothesis, was elegant. It was intellectually satisfying. It seemed to explain almost everything in one neat self-contained package. The DMSO use explained the garlicky smell and the oily sheen. The crystallization of its metabolite, dimethyl sulfone, explained the particles in the blood, and the theoretical conversion of that metabolite into the highly toxic dimethyl sulfate, a conversion ironically triggered by the administration of life-saving oxygen, explained the mass poisoning of the staff. It was a theory that blamed no one. It wasn't the hospital's fault. It wasn't the staff's fault. It wasn't even really Gloria's fault. It was a tragic one-in-a-billion confluence of factors. A specific home remedy, a specific pre-existing disease, and a specific life-saving medical procedure that, in this unique case, had a catastrophic and unforeseen result. The theory was presented to the coroner's office and later published in the peer-reviewed journal Forensic Science International. For many in the public and the media, this was case closed. It was the definitive scientific explanation that finally brought sense to a chaotic and terrifying event. The mystery of the toxic lady, it seemed, had been solved by science. However, the DMSO hypothesis is far from universally accepted. In the years since it was proposed, it has been heavily and persistently criticized by many independent scientists, chemists, and toxicologists, who point to several significant and perhaps fatal flaws in the theory. First, and most importantly, there is no direct physical evidence to support the theory's central claim. The linchpin of the entire hypothesis is the presence of the killer chemical, dimethyl sulfate, in Gloria's blood. But it was never found. The Livermore team inferred its existence. They did not detect it. The defenders of the theory argue that this is because dimethyl sulfate is so incredibly unstable and reactive that it would have broken down completely in the minutes and hours after its creation, and certainly would have been long gone by the time they were able to test the tissue samples 6 days later. But critics argue that a theory that hinges on an undetectable phantom chemical is, by definition, weak. A theory without direct, verifiable evidence is just speculation, no matter how elegant it may be. Second, the proposed chemical conversion itself is highly questionable. The idea that oxygen from a face mask could, at body temperature and pressure, convert dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate is a chemical reaction that has never been documented before or since. There is no known biological or chemical pathway for this to occur under the conditions of human physiology. Critics, including many organic chemists, have argued that it's a theoretical reaction that is thermodynamically and kinetically highly unlikely to happen outside of a specialized industrial reactor. They argue that the Livermore team, starting with their desired conclusion that dimethyl sulfate was the cause, worked backwards to invent a chemical pathway to get there, regardless of its real-world plausibility. Third, while dimethyl sulfate is highly toxic, the specific set of symptoms experienced by the ER staff don't perfectly match its known effects. One of the classic signs of severe dimethyl sulfate exposure is severe, delayed-onset blistering of the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract, often leading to pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. These symptoms were not prominent in the Riverside victims. The set of symptoms they did experience, the rapid onset of fainting, muscle spasms, and the later development of pancreatitis and avascular necrosis, while certainly severe, are not the textbook signs of dimethyl sulfate poisoning. Finally, and perhaps most damningly for its official status, the Riverside coroner's office itself, The very body that commissioned the Livermore report ultimately rejected the theory as the official explanation. In their final definitive report on the case, released in September 1994, they acknowledged the Livermore hypothesis as an interesting piece of speculation. But they found it unproven and insufficient to be listed as the official cause of the incident. The final report from the coroner's office concluded that Gloria Ramirez had died of natural causes, and that the hospital staff had been sickened by an unknown substance, but that they could not definitively identify what that substance was or where it came from. The official cause of the mass illness remains, to this day, unexplained. This leaves us in a deeply unsatisfying, but perhaps intellectually honest place. If the most comprehensive and widely reported scientific theory is flawed and officially rejected, where does that leave us? The case of Gloria Ramirez remains an open wound in the history of medicine and forensic science. We are left with a collection of theories, none of which perfectly fits all the strange and stubborn facts of the case. We have the mass hysteria theory, which is contradicted by the hard medical evidence of severe, objective physical harm. We have the external contaminant theory, which is completely unsupported by any evidence found at her home or in her personal life. And we have the elegant but unproven DMSO theory, a beautiful chain of chemical reactions that seems plausible on paper but lacks direct proof and relies on a chemical conversion that may not even be possible. The truth is, we may never know for certain what happened in Trauma Room 1 on that night. The case of Gloria Ramirez, the Toxic Lady, has achieved its legendary status precisely because it so stubbornly resists easy explanation. It sits at the uncomfortable intersection of known science and unexplained phenomena. It is a stark and humbling reminder that despite all our advanced technology, our sophisticated laboratories, and our deep scientific knowledge, the universe, and the incredibly complex, mysterious chemical factory of the human body, can still produce mysteries that leave us baffled, humbled, and frankly terrified. The story serves as a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes there are no easy answers, and sometimes the truth is not just stranger than we imagine, but stranger than we can imagine. Thank you for joining us on this deep and detailed dive into the investigation and the competing theories behind the Gloria Ramirez case. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about the world and forces us to confront the very real limits of our own understanding. If you found this exploration of this profound medical mystery compelling, please show your support by liking this audio, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. It truly helps us continue to investigate these complex and fascinating stories from the shadowy corners of history and science. Now we turn the final verdict over to you. Having heard the evidence and the detailed breakdown of the competing scientific explanations, which theory do you find most convincing? Do you believe the elegant DMSO hypothesis, despite its significant flaws? Do you think the mass hysteria theory has more merit than the victims believe? Or do you think the truth lies in another direction entirely, an explanation that has been overlooked or is yet to be discovered? We are genuinely interested in your perspective. Please share your thoughts, your analysis, and your own theories in the comments section below. The case of the Toxic Lady is more than just a medical mystery or an unexplained illness. It is a profound human tragedy. A woman died in pain and confusion. A grieving family was denied clear answers and had to see their loved one turned into a media spectacle. And a group of dedicated healers, people who had devoted their lives to easing suffering, were themselves harmed in the line of duty, their lives and careers forever altered by a single inexplicable event. It is a story that, even without a final satisfying answer, teaches us a powerful lesson about the profound and sometimes terrifying mysteries that lie hidden, waiting within us all. Until next time, sleep well.